Social Media and the Age of Disinformation. Good afternoon and welcome to Florida International University's Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs in this webinar series brought to you by the Ruth K. and Shepard Broad Distinguished Lecture Series. Today's webinar is co-sponsored by FIU's College of Business, the Wolfsonian at FIU, and the Jack D. Gordon Institute for Public Policy. I'm David Kramer, Senior Fellow in the Václav Havel Program in the Stephen J. Green School, as well as Director of the European and Eurasian Studies Program, all here at FIU in Miami. And for those of you who have only lived in the age of social media, you might not know that disinformation, misinformation, and propaganda are not new phenomena. They have been around for a long time. But in today's digital world, these phenomena have taken on a new and much faster life. Unchecked, they can cause havoc and add to social divides, advance nefarious agendas, and contribute to a general breakdown in trust. The threats come not only from outside actors who do not wish us well, they also come from within our own societies. How can you discern disinformation and misinformation and propaganda from the real news and facts? What can you do to raise your guard against these phenomena? For a historical perspective, we have a terrific panel to look at this and the contemporary challenges we face. Dr. Francis Luca is Chief Librarian at the Wolfsonian at FIU and Adjunct Professor in the Department of History at Florida International University. Dr. Nancy Richmond is Assistant Teaching Professor in the Department of Marketing and Logistics at FIU's College of Business. And last but not least is Brian Fonseca, Director of the Jack D. Gordon Institute for Public Policy and Executive Director of Cybersecurity at FIU. So welcome to all three of you for this very important and timely discussion, particularly in the age of the pandemic. And if we can, I'm going to ask each of you to make some brief opening remarks. And Frank, why don't we start with you?
Thank you very much. So I thought I would start by giving a little bit of history and maybe playing around a little bit with some definitions of what we're going to be discussing. So things like propaganda, things like disinformation, misinformation. So full disclosure, I work at the Wolfsonian, Florida International University. The original name of the institution was the Wolfson Foundation for Decorative and Propaganda Arts. And I love that they changed the title because answering the phone like that, it's just too long. But one of the reasons they did change it was because of the negative connotations of the word propaganda. So I wanted to start with the idea of propaganda here and the idea of, is propaganda always a bad thing? My wife is Colombian. She uses the word propaganda in a way that I would not have thought it used. She refers to propaganda as mere advertising. So advertising is propaganda. So it does not necessarily have to be political. It can be commercial. This little image of Donald Duck that you're seeing here was actually a pamphlet put out by the US government during World War II. And it was designed to sort of teach the GIs about propaganda so that they wouldn't be manipulated. This was part of something called the GI Roundtable. And to me, it's very interesting because this was not some heavy-handed government-sponsored thing saying, okay, here's what you need to believe. It was a roundtable, and they provided ideas for discussions. They certainly had point of view and an agenda, but they wanted to create discussions and have people discuss and think about these issues, not just tell them this is what you should think and believe. So I thought that was a nice way to sort of start. If we could go to the next slide. Talking about the idea of fake news, we sort of hear that phrase thrown around today all the time. Fake news, again, is nothing new. I wanted to focus on one particular individual, William Randolph Hearst, who was a major publishing magnate in the United States. And Hearst, we oftentimes associate him with the idea of journalists getting the United States into the war with the Spanish-American War and telling his correspondent who told him, well, there's no pictures to draw here, there's no war happening. And infamously, supposedly saying back to that journalist, although there's been no cables to verify that, you supply the pictures, I'll supply the war. So this idea of propaganda in newspapers even being as influential as starting wars for the United States. Hearst also has an unsavory reputation in the 1930s and 40s. After Adolf Hitler came to power, he visited him in Germany and made a deal with the devil, basically taking money from him to sort of clean up the Nazi image in his news media. So that's a little bit of a place to start as well. If we could advance to the next slide. I love this one of Bernard McFadden. This is the idea of misinformation. So not necessarily propaganda or disinformation, which I would define as something deliberately trying to get you to believe something maybe incorrect, but the idea of misinformation and the idea of advocacy journalism. So fake news is not necessarily fake, it may be advocacy journalism. That is to say, where a publisher has a point of view and he uses his magazines and newspapers to spread that point of view. In this particular case, you can see at the top, George Bernard Shaw says, vaccination a crime. So this idea of anti-vaccines, that's nothing new either. This is coming out in the 1930s and 40s, and you had influencers, important people like George Bernard Shaw, who were used as an influencer, since a lot of people looked up to him, to say, oh, well, if George Bernard Shaw says this, it must be true. I love the cover to the right because the New Masses magazine made fun of Bernard McFadden. The term pornography was actually coined for Bernard McFadden's magazines. He published something called The Telegraphy, which other people said, that's not real journalism, that's poor journalism. So they made poor and telegraphy, pornography as a joke. He also used lots of images of beautiful bathing women on the front covers of his magazine. So there again is that association. So they made fun of him by putting him in one of those skimpy outfits to sort of poke fun. If we could go to the next slide, there's just a few more of these. So the idea of fakes online is also nothing new. As early as the camera was invented, people were finding ways to cut and paste, to virtually or literally Photoshop in those days to make images give a different truth. So over here, you can see how the Nazis did it with these two women attending some Nazi rally, but this poor little kid in the middle didn't have the right look. So in other publications, they just Photoshopped him out. If you go to the next slide. Another example of that, we have these two women also attending some rally. Well, once you attend one rally and they have your photograph, that photograph can be cut and pasted and reproduced to show you always looking up in awe of the great leader as a sort of ubiquitous Hitler groupie from there on in. And if you could advance to the next slide. So this is something that I liked to play around with the idea. Again, the idea of disinformation we normally think of as a bad thing and something done by regimes to try and trick us and manipulate us into believing something we shouldn't believe. I would actually argue that disinformation can actually be a good thing as well. So this is artwork, a photo montage by a man whose name was Helmut Herzfeld. He was a German. He so disliked the Nazis that he wanted to disassociate himself from the regime. So he changed his name to John Hartfield. And he started saying, well, since Nazis stage photos and Photoshop photos to make them lie, I'm going to Photoshop images to tell the truth behind the lies. So here we have this wonderful image called Diagnosis. And We have what looks to be an X-ray machine, but it's not. And we have these two guys in lab coats to represent doctors. And the joke is that this is the organic result of too many Heil Hitlers. In other words, too many Heil Hitlers will warp your spine. So he was making a very clever political statement using photo montage or fake photographs to get to the truth behind the fakes. And then I think we have one last slide. And this is a quote that I wanted to read from Vice President Henry Wallace, made in 1942. The American fascist would prefer not to use violence. His method is to poison the channels of public information. With a fascist, the problem is never how to best present the truth to the public, but how best to use the news to deceive the public into giving the fascist and his group more money or more power. And I think that's a perfect segue into where we are today.
Great. Thanks so much, Frank. Nancy, over to you.
Great. Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Nancy Richmond. I teach in the College of Business, social media marketing. I also am an avid social media user. I have over 400,000 social media followers. That includes LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. Since I teach social media, I spend a lot of time on there trying to figure out how to use it. And in my position, I'm really helping people learn how to use it for marketing. So it's funny that Frank said at the very beginning that his wife thinks about propaganda as advertising, because I definitely don't think about it in that way, but I think that's very interesting. And marketing and logistic department is where I teach. But one of the things that is important to me is understanding and helping our students understand what information is real, what information is fake online. And I'm actually starting to begin to realize that this is becoming an increasing problem. And one of the things that I wanted to talk to you all about today was on June 1st, I went on Twitter. I woke up one morning and I went on Twitter. And when I woke up, I saw DC blackout actually trending on social media. And that tweet was saying that the US government had turned off all cell phones and all of the internet in Washington, DC, where protests were happening. And it caused a lot of fury. And people were getting very angry online. It was trending not just in the United States, but it was trending globally. And this was on June 1st of this year. And what I noticed when I looked at the accounts was that a lot of the accounts lacked original content. Some had few followers, some had some unusual photos. Many had the same photo. So you would look and it'd be like one account with the same photo as another. Another thing that I noticed was that there was a photo that was being shared of a large fire near the Washington Monument. And so at the same time, there were also accounts that were tweeting that the DC blackout was fake. So there were three different things going on at the same time, and it was causing a lot of confusion. And this confusion was being caused on purpose. And I've seen a lot of disinformation that's happened, but this was a very targeted sort of campaign to create anger with the protesters. And it was something that really, I thought, as a social media specialist, if I can't even figure out if this is real or not, what about someone who doesn't specialize in that? And if that's the case, we definitely have a problem. So that was something, a story that I wanted to share with you. Twitter has since taken down those accounts. And then just about a week ago, Twitter also noticed that there was a lot of fake tweets that were going out from China about the coronavirus. So that was another disinformation campaign that was sort of happening, a manipulated and coordinated campaign. And Twitter has now said that they are going to take action, that they are going to try to stop this. Now, one of the things that is important when we're talking about this is that in 2016, USC analyzed election-related tweets, and 19% of those were sent by bots. They could tell that these were bots, and they were trying purposely to send out information both on the far left as well as on the far right, to cause mass confusion and anger. In 2020, on Carnegie Mellon University reported that nearly half of the Twitter accounts spreading messages on social media about the coronavirus were likely bots and sending information that was not true. So if this is the case, then one of my concerns with social media is definitely the upcoming election. And I think that I will leave it there. So I'll let Brian go from there.
Nancy, thank you very much. Brian, over to you. You're mute. There you go.
I'm on now. Thank you. To Nancy's point, I think year after year, consistently, we see roughly 60% of web traffic is actually human, which means that there's an overwhelming amount of information flowing through the internet that is either characterized as disinformation, misinformation. And I want to build off of Frank's presentation, talk a little bit about the definitions, and then I'll give some thoughts on where I think it's going. So our focus is looking at sort of this concept of information operations, information warfare. I mean, there's lots of terms used to describe the role of information, particularly in the geopolitical spaces. And that's one of the areas that I look at, specifically Russian, Chinese, misinformation, disinformation. So a lot of times these terms get used interchangeably. There's some conceptual fuzziness around them. And so I thought I would start off with just sort of defining some of the prominent terminology in the context of the information space. And so we start with disinformation, which is aptly the title of this talk. And disinformation is really about intent. And so we define information in the context of intent. Disinformation from the context of intent is really about the intent to deceive, right? So it is intentional deception. Oftentimes it's comprised of either wholly unfactual or false information, or a combination of false information and truth to sort of give it maybe a better veneer of truth, and in the hopes of shaping behavior or cognition in some particular way. But that's really disinformation. By the way, there's debates as to the origins of disinformation. While propaganda certainly has existed for a very long time, perhaps disinformation is being traced back to the 20th century. Some have argued that the term disinformation stems from Joseph Stalin. The Russian term for disinformation was sort of coined, and it's been a really important element of how Russia is engaged in the information space, sort of leveraging disinformation. We can talk more about that later on, because I think it's really fascinating how they've combined psychologists with technologists, as well as sort of policy or political scientists, to message methodically and carefully to really targeted audiences, understanding what may make those audiences tick. And so disinformation is really the intention of deception, deceiving. Misinformation gets characterized normally as sort of the intention of just misunderstanding. So that could be, propagating false information or mischaracterized information, but it's really, not intended to purposefully deceive. It may be someone on your social media that shares something without giving it much thought and is propagating, a false understanding and in a non-malicious way. And so that's usually how we characterize misinformation. Again, it's mischaracterized, or it could be false information, but it's propagated without the intent to deceive. We talk about propaganda, which goes way, way back, and I absolutely agree with Frank that propaganda gets a really bad name these days, largely because it does have sort of intentionality to it, right? So this could be, information that is accurate, factually correct information, but it's used for the purpose of political effect, right? To shape cognition or behavior in a certain way that may lean it in favor of one group or one constituency over the other. The term that's, I think, even more conceptually fuzzy is this term fake news, which you hear fake news being used in a variety of different ways. But fake news generally is sort of consistent with the notion of disinformation, really about false information being propagated in a way to distort. It's often used in the context of offense, of trying to sort of discredit. David, as you and I have talked about before, discredit But fake news is certainly conceptually fuzzy and lots of different people using it in very different contexts. And so that's sort of the landscape of information. There's also, malinformation. There's a variety of other, cyber-enabled information. And so there's other terms that, sort of get conflated in the information space that tend to generally, describe, very similar things that we get out of disinformation, misinformation, propaganda, which I tend to think those are the three dominant concepts in the information space to help describe, the intentionality of information, what it's designed to do. To Nancy's point, and building off of what she said, I think one of the things that we know today is that the social media and digital landscape has just blown up, the pace and texture in which information flows. And so, this is, again, none of this is new, but the means or the platforms in which we use to deliver information are rapidly changing. And just the introduction of bot networks. And so you take Russia, for example, we used to, Russia has the Internet Research Agency. We used to, there's, some colleagues that have sort of coined that, that organization as the troll farm, right? These were people like you and I, going into chat rooms or going into comment sections and just trying to blow things up, right? Trying to, that's where the term troll is employed, and we call it the troll farm. It was largely human. Over the last few years, you've seen the troll farm take on a huge, element of leveraging bot networks to propagate that information. And there are things that you can, to characterize bot networks, and we can certainly talk about that. But I think in terms of intentionality, disinformation, misinformation, propaganda, the intentions differ slightly, and then delivery has just really grown exponentially in the last few years, which makes it much more difficult to catch information because it's moving so fast and so wide. And so, our ability to mitigate that has not matched the ability to propagate that kind of information. So I'll stop there and look forward to some real good conversation.
Great, Brian, thanks very much. Thanks to all three of you for some great opening comments. And let me just let our viewers know that we'll be happy a little later on to take any questions you may have. There's the Q&A function on the lower part of the screen. The chat function is not working. That's disabled, but the Q&A is the place to send in your questions to the panel. Let me just ask Frank, Nancy, if you have any reaction to Brian's definitions of these terms, just so we might be on some common ground about the typography, if you will, about the issue.
I think I'd have to agree very much with the definitions as he's given them. But again, a little bit more background on propaganda. The word itself stems from the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages, the propagation of the faith. So propaganda was originally not intended to have any sort of negative connotation. It was the idea of spreading the faith and saving souls. One could argue, if you're not of that particular religious denomination, whether you might characterize it as neutral. But from the perspective, at least, of the Catholic Church, propaganda was considered a positive thing. And obviously, as quickly as you had people dissenting with the Catholic Church's ideas and dogma, you had propaganda of an anti-Catholic nature with the Protestant movement. And this came at a time when printing presses were just becoming available. So much like today, you had this incredible proliferation of these pamphlets that were put out to attack the Catholic Church on various issues. And it was because it was a new kind of technology that enabled it to spread, whereas other of these attempts were either, clamped down as heresies and stopped in the age before you had this new media technology of printing presses. So now we have a new technology through the internet where we're going to have to sort of figure out, again, how do we deal with this new proliferation of this very old technique of sending out your message via propaganda.
Nancy, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think that's terrific, Brian and Frank. I totally agree with you. And I would say those definitions are spot on. I think the danger we have is when we use the word fake news. And when we use that word fake news, it's a danger because it discredits the media. And I know when I'm trying to figure out what's going on, one of the first places I'm going to go to is the media. Is any of the large media sites actually posting on this? Because they're doing a lot of research. They're really trying to figure out what's going on. And I think it's really important that we not just look at one site, but that we look at many different sites when we are looking to see if this is real or is this fake. And so using that word fake news, I think, can sometimes cause confusion. And if we think every media site is fake, where on earth are we going to get our news? So, and how are we ever going to tell if anything's real? So, so I think that that's terrific. And I think that those definitions are right on.
So let me get to the issue of sourcing. And by that, I mean, where are these threats coming from that we're talking about on disinformation, misinformation, and other things? Brian, let me start with you. Looking at external actors, you mentioned Russia, you mentioned China, Iran, North Korea, Venezuela, where else should we keep an eye on?
Yeah, I mean, so you have to think about, again, intentionality. So in many cases, information operations are either designed for internal or external consumption, right? So you take North Korea that you raised. I remember probably one of the more prolific stories running around North Korea in 2014 was that North Korea beat the United States in the World Cup. And they beat us really, really badly. Well, if you follow the World Cup, that obviously didn't happen. But that disinformation was designed to propagate inside North Korea, of course, not having any credibility outside of North Korea. And so, again, audience matters. So certainly North Korea, Iran are also in sort of the basket of proliferating disinformation as part of information operations. China and Russia are two that I've been following very closely. And if you take Russia, for example, what's really interesting about Russia is Russia has really institutionalized the concept of information warfare, in sort of Russian strategic security doctrine. Like I said, the term disinformation may have originated in Russia in the 20s. We certainly saw during the Soviet period an institutionalizing of what they call sort of active measures, right? Sort of this idea to continue to propagate information even in peacetime that would, ultimately lend to sort of your strategic interests and strategic outcome. The Cold War was a really intense period in which information was being used in a very weaponized fashion. If you take, for example, just in the disinformation camp, one of the more notorious stories running around at that time was that the U.S. had injected, had sort of discovered and proliferated HIV and introduced HIV to the world, right? We're having those similar discussions now about sort of the intentional introduction of COVID-19, also by the U.S. Army, which Chinese Foreign Ministry has come out and said recently, which one of the first times I've actually seen, blatant disinformation coming out of the Chinese, government, sort of blatant disinformation by public officials in the foreign ministry. But nonetheless, that story that the Russians planted in an Indian newspaper, they leveraged document forgers to be able to pen what looked to be official U.S. correspondence that gave off this feel that it was again something that the U.S. had contributed to, and it was about sort of again trying to build some opposition to American interests globally. One maybe that hits a little bit closer to home during that same period in a Russian newspaper print media outlet in Central America. The Russians had posted or published something essentially asserting that the United States had used napalm in El Salvador during the war in 1980 to 1992, the civil war in El Salvador. Obviously, that was very unpopular because of American use of sort of that in Vietnam. And again, what they were looking to do was build some type of global momentum against the United States. And so the Cold War was very, very, this was very popular for the Russians, and the Russians have continued to institutionalize that effort. China has, is certainly growing in terms of capability. In fact, there was a 2015 memo between Russia and China in which Russia had, at least in principle, agreed to support China in terms of its ability to propagate information in the international context, while China would help Russia develop its own internal Great Firewall, sort of akin to the term that that we use to talk about firewalling information for domestic consumption. And so I'll stop there, but certainly looking at the geopolitics, it's on the rise, no doubt.
Nancy, let me ask you about domestic sources that we face. How would you describe those?
Yeah, it's interesting that that you asked that. I see two things. I see here in the U.S. Definitely during the protests, there were a lot of groups that were online trying to purposely cause anger, and definitely fake accounts. So we definitely have in the United States groups that are trying to use social media to cause anger and just chaos. I mean, that's what I would say. Anger and chaos, those two things. And not really one way or the other, but just causing confusion, right? Just trying to cause confusion. The other thing that I would say is that during our last election, the Ukrainians were sending out a whole lot of bots and misinformation. And you would see, for example, a Twitter profile that said, I am an all-American Army vet that is anti-immigration. And then there would be a lot of anti-immigration posts that were just off the wall and totally extreme. And then you would go down maybe like 100 posts or 50 posts, and you would look and everything was in Ukrainian. So it was clearly a Ukrainian account, and there were a lot of different examples of that. So I don't know if Brian, if you've noticed that that's still the case, but that was definitely a case during the last election.
And Frank, looking at it from a bit of a historical perspective, was the main threat coming from the Soviet Union in this ideological competition between the United States and the Soviet Union, or did we face other threats as well?
I think it was, well, if we're looking at the period of the 1930s and 40s, which is an area that I'm mostly focused on, I would have to say there were really two threats in the extremes of left and right. So the Soviet Union was certainly a threat with the idea of also everything having to be politically correct. We use that term today to sort of say, don't say the wrong word. That would be, something that we all share of, yeah, obviously you don't offend someone, but the actual term political correctness was coined by the Soviets, where they had to make sure all of the information being disseminated under the new regime was according to the ideology, and that was politically correct that way. So certainly the Soviets were one challenge, but I would say the fascists and the Nazis were certainly a challenge on the other side. And tying that to today as well, again, the reason I think it's so interesting to focus on Hearst, I think it was something like 1 in every 3 Americans was reading a Hearst paper or influenced by Hearst magazines or even the news outlets that he was producing. And he was taking money from the Nazis to clean up their image. So this is a domestic media outlet that is actually serving in some ways as a fifth column of a foreign power. So I think the threats in the 1930s are in some ways similar to the threats that we experience today. It's outside powers using and manipulating divisions within America that already exist and using sometimes the media and sometimes individuals to sort of amplify and increase those divisions within the country.
I'm going to actually, at the risk of not having checked and vetted this, just let people know who are watching. A headline just popped on my phone from Bloomberg saying, because I think this is of interest to a lot of our students and others, the U.S. will rescind a new policy requiring foreign students to leave the country if their schools switch to online-only classes. So that is good news on rescinding what was an absolutely insane initial effort to try to go after foreign students. I'm going to turn to questions that have come in, and thanks very much to those of you who have sent in questions. And let me start with Frank Reyes. He asked, and I'm sure this is on the mind of many people, and it's going to lead me to ask a follow-up question, I think for Nancy, maybe if we could start. How would you categorize the messaging from the POTUS, meaning the President of the United States, tweets on sowing distrust in our election systems, comments on vote by mail being fraudulent, when the body of evidence has determined that vote by mail is secure. And Nancy, that also brings up the issue of Facebook and Twitter taking action on some of the president's tweets. So if you could assess that for us.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is definitely a really important piece to talk about is what do you do if the president of the United States posts something that maybe is not true? And so do you call them out on it? And especially if you're Twitter and you're living in that country and that's your president, it's a very hard call. And Twitter has decided that they are going to take action. And we, on social media, I think that the great thing about social media is when it started, the best thing about social media was that it gave people a voice, right? Anyone can say anything that they want on Twitter. And that's the power, is it gives the people a voice. But your voice no longer works if the information that's being spread more is not true, and this disinformation that's being spread is not true. Then the platform basically becomes unusable. And so I think that Facebook and Twitter have really decided that they need to start taking action. Whether they'll be able to take enough action, I don't know. Twitter has taken down some tweets related to China, the coronavirus. They obviously also put information on the president's tweets saying that fact-checking his tweets. So, and then that caused some anger for people saying that we need to have a freedom of speech, right? And we should be able to say what we want to say. But there definitely is a problem when that information is not true. I think it's going to be really interesting to see, both with advertisements. So Facebook has taken action with advertisements. So for this campaign, if you see political ads now on Facebook, you can tell where the ad is being paid from, so that foreign governments can't be paying for ads. And so they have taken some action, but some would say that they have not taken enough action. And so it will be interesting to see what happens with that in the future.
Thank you. And Frank, let me go to you with a question from Mohammed Masri, who asks, how was disinformation tackled before the era of social media?
That's a good question. Again, I like to turn to people like John Hartfield, which I showed you that one image of. When you talk about disinformation in the other age, it's a difficult thing, because you could have someone publishing a photograph, and the idea was that, well, photos don't lie, right? We all know that it's a photograph, it's objective truth. And yet this was the idea that, no, you can't necessarily believe your eyes in this case, which is what you would think would be the most normal thing, right? Seeing is believing. If you can't believe what you're seeing in a photograph, how do you know what's real and what's not real? So again, I think of pioneers and people like John Hartfield as a sort of heroes in a way, to sort of say, I'm going to show you that photographs lie all the time, and I'm going to make mine so obvious that you know that it's not real, but it's getting to the larger truth behind the reality behind the lies by manipulating those objective truth photographs. So again, this was the age before Photoshop. They literally just cut with a pair of kitchen scissors, cut the photographs, pasted them, did a little doctoring with some whiteout type substance, and that was done all the time. And I have to tell you, even in photographs that you don't think are doctored, most photographs that were included in magazines and newspapers were doctored in some way, because you had to highlight behind someone's head to make them stand out a little bit more. Or if there's a kid looking in the wrong direction and it distracts from the rest of the image, you just cut that part out or literally edit them out. So these things were being done in the same way that Photoshoppers are doing that today. It was just, they were doing them hands-on rather
Great.
than on.
I should explain why I smiled when you used the word whiteout, because I'm old enough to remember that whiteout was what we used to use when we made mistakes while typing out our papers in school, for those of you who are far too young.
I think it's interesting, Frank, because you're talking about, you know, pieces of paper. And in social media, we don't really think about traditional, like a piece of paper. But I can tell you, I went on Facebook during the Black Lives Matters protest, and one of my friends who lives in Chinatown in New York City posted a flyer, okay, on Facebook that somebody had posted in his neighborhood expressing extreme hate towards the Chinese community. And then when I went on Twitter, I was like, this is crazy. And I went on Twitter and it was posted throughout that it was definitely an effort to cause disinformation, and it was posted everywhere. And people were taking pictures of it and then they were posting it on social media. So even if it's not something that's on social media, people can take photos of it and then suddenly it becomes, and then it spread so quickly. Even the senator got involved with it. I mean, it was very bad. So, and it was purposely to cause people to get angry for sure. So, so I think that that's interesting.
So just so Paul and Sarah know, I am going to get to your questions, but they lead us to what do we do about all this? So I'm going to leave them for a little toward the end, but thank you for your patience and thank you for the great questions. Brian, let me pose David Skip's question to you. Is it conceivable to imagine the technical capability of social media outlets to ID and block bots? Can the technology, can the companies, the providers, help in distilling these efforts from outside?
It's a great question. The answer is maybe. I don't know. The problem is that you know, for the advances that these types of organizations make in terms of being able to identify and characterize, classify, you know, disinformation, misinformation, there's also technology that's also advancing the ability to propagate disinformation, misinformation, right? And so the term that we've been hearing a lot about over the last few years is deep fakes, right? And this is, again, efforts to try to bypass any type of automated recognition software or some type of AI, you know, algorithm that's able to detect, you know, Photoshop has been used in a particular film or, I mean, a particular photo or and automatically, you know, sort of censor that material. There's no doubt that they're trying to do that very rapidly. You know, but the challenge, and Nancy brought it up, is one of sort of the balance between, you know, sort of civil liberties and the ability to be able to propagate something that's fake if you want to, you know, versus, you know, having it censored. And that debate, I think, will continue to grow in the United States. The challenge is that it's going to have, you know, when you think about the difference between maybe someone putting a joke out there in their social media space that may be comprised of, you know, false information for effect of the joke, versus some type of technology that automatically censors that, that ability to propagate that. I think that's a really important debate that we're going through right now that I think, you know, certainly our students should be a part of and continue to watch very carefully. And, you know, there are lots of ways that people are talking about how to get by that. How do you then characterize certain types of language or certain types of themes off limits for, you know, for freedom of speech and those sort of protesting back. But there's no doubt that, to David's point, that there's certainly an effort in social media companies. You're already seeing that with Facebook and Twitter to be able to ID fake things and censor it automatically. But again, it lends to a debate, you know, that I think is going to, you know, become even more far-reaching in the country. I want to touch on something that was brought up earlier in terms of, you know, the ways they think about how do you, you know, mitigating, at least in the past, mitigating some of the information, and not to displace what we're going to talk about at the end, but certainly looking at, you know, the difference between sort of going after the source versus going after the narrative. And that's really important in the information space, is to differentiate the source from the narrative. And so you've seen some really powerful studies by MIT has, I think, one of the more recent and wide-ranging studies that really look at, you know, does attacking the source really, you know, so if you discredit the source, does that impact the, you know, the value of the information, or do you, you know, sort of correct the false narrative, and how do you approach it? So that's been going on for some time. And I know, David, when you were at the State Department, you were there just after the United States disbanded the U.S. Information Agency. which were tackling some of those very big issues of how do you address, coming out of the Cold War, how do you address, not just sort of our propagation of information, but our adversaries' propagation of information as it undermined our interests in the United States. And so long stories, we'll continue to see technology, attempt to mitigate and look at those types of mitigating factors about, sort of intentionality. But you're also going to have, information proliferators that will continue to find ways to, push false information out there.
I arrived at the State Department just as states stopped using Wing computers, just to give you an idea of how behind the State Department was in technology.
I wasn't going to throw that out there, David.
And how old I am. Yes, thank you. Nancy, let me come to you with JD Cardona's, and then I promise Sarah and Paul, I'm going to come to your questions, but let me come to you with JD's question about what experience have you seen in terms of pushing back on a nation state that is engaging in trying to generate chaos, confusion, and divisiveness. Just last week in an interview with Mark Thiessen, a columnist in the Washington Post, President Trump acknowledged that he had authorized a cyber attack, I guess, against the Information Research Agency in St. Petersburg, Russia, in connection with the 2018 elections. But what are some ways to deal with a nation state that's engaging in this activity?
I mean, I think it's really difficult. The question is, do we rely on Twitter and Facebook to figure this out, or does our government put some laws in place to help figure out what they can and what they can't do? And I don't think we figured this out yet. We've been extremely slow. Our politicians have been extremely slow at figuring out should we be regulating, if at all, social media. When Mark Zuckerberg went to the Senate, they called it the Facebook, and they asked how they made money, and the answer was advertisements. And so I can't even believe that was a question. How could our senators not know that? So I think that our government has been very, very slow at kind of keeping up, and social media has been moving extremely fast. The European Union has laws and they have regulations now that are far more advanced than our own about what people can post for advertisements and how they can be posting and have a little bit more transparent. So just like with radio and with TV, there are certain things you can and you can't do. In social media, that it has not been the case. So it's going to take time, I think, for our laws to catch up. And to really figure out what do we say that Twitter and Facebook and these private companies need to figure out on their own. And then at the same time, what kind of laws can our own government put in place to really help making sure that everyone's sort of on the same playing field.
So I know, Brian, you want to jump in on this, but let me also add to it. You alluded to the weaponization of material that Russia, for example, and the Clinton emails stole and then put out there to try to have an impact on the election campaign. The Chinese hacked into the Office of Personnel Management database, although as far as I know, have not so far weaponized that information. They may be holding it for another time. So how do we deal with things like that as well?
Yeah, I mean, I want to build off of what Nancy said. I think that if nation states are going to leverage disinformation, we're talking specifically about sort of the weaponization of false information, then you have to consider that you have to go into your toolbox and look at diplomatic, economic, responses. And at the end of the day, I think the U.S. government has already indicated its intent on leveraging both punitive and sort of incentives to try to curb the use of disinformation, particularly as it relates to the 2020 elections. This was a big deal, not just in 2016 because of what we found, but in 2018 because of our attempts to try to mitigate influence in the 2018 elections. And I think if you listen to folks like Paul Nagasaki from U.S. Cyber Command, there was a degree of effect in terms of the ability to mitigate a disruption in the 2018 elections. That's not to say that, again, it's been resolved. Nation states will continue to try to leverage various forms of information, but then you have to consider what tools or instruments of national power do you have to curb nation states from levying those against you. And I think you have to consider diplomatic, you have to consider economic, and in the context of military as an instrument of national power, you think about cyber. And so, yes, the U.S. government has recently come out and said that it issued, or the president had, authorized a cyber attack against the internet, Russia's Internet Research Agency. But this is not the first time that the United States has, acknowledged the fact that it has launched a cyber attack against Russia as part of an attempt to try to, to force Russia to move away from using these types of attacks against the United States. So I'll end there. But
okay, great. So I'm going to get to the last two questions, but before I do, I'll just mention that my wonderful colleague Christine Kelly has sent in a note with a link to the European Commission's efforts in tackling online disinformation. I think everyone can see that available in the Q&A back and forth. All right, so Paul Krauth, I hope I've pronounced his last name right, and Sarid Castro have been very patient, but asked two questions that get us, as we approach the end of this, on what do we do here? And maybe Frank, if I could start with you, with Paul's question, what responsibility ultimately is it to monitor the information before it has a chance to go viral? Who has that responsibility?
Well, I'm going to give the tough answer here. And I have to say, the government obviously needs to step in and step up its game along those lines. But I think it's also incumbent upon all of us as citizens in a democracy to do our part as well. And that very first slide that I used, that Donald Duck image, which was a pamphlet, again, designed with the idea of democracy only works if we have an informed citizenry and an educated and enlightened electorate. So it's incumbent upon all of us as citizens, I think, to be more discerning consumers of information. This is something that we can't just expect our government to do, but we have to be careful of. And I talk to my students all the time in the context of the history department, what constitutes a legitimate source? When you look at some source that says it's Joe Snogg's blog post, well, that's wonderful. Who is Joe Snogg? So it's more important to look at who is publishing these things, what is their intent in publishing them, is it legitimate information? And how we know that is a little bit of knowing, are there publishers, are there fact checkers, are there editors there to sort of check that information before it goes out and before we accept it into our heads and then start spreading it ourselves.
So Nancy, let me turn to you if you want to comment on that question. And I should add, by the way, that Paul was saying it isn't just people who are deliberately trying to disinform. It's people who are simply sharing, forwarding, retweeting things, perhaps not being aware of what the impact they may have. But also Sarid's question about sites you would recommend to get trustworthy information and to stay tuned on what's really happening out there. And I don't know if you want to use this opportunity for your slides as well.
Yeah, I think so. So I created just a couple of slides. I'll go through them pretty quickly because I know we don't have too much time left. And also I want to give Brian a chance. And Brian, feel free to talk as well during the slide. If you guys could show the
Hey, Rigo, if you can, or Andre, if you can get the slides up, that would be great. Thanks a lot.
So, so the first thing was to check the source. So I recommend looking it up and look at least 3 different places, 3 different sites to see, is this true? Another important piece is who posted this content. You want to see who posted this. Is this a reliable source? Is this a real account? Is this, and remember too, that real people who usually know what's going on sometimes post fake stuff because they get tricked. So that's why it's good to check 3 different times to see where is this real, is this not real. You ask for some real sites. I recommend Snoops, factcheck.org. Brian, Frank, do you have any others that you would add there?
No, I think those are good fact-checking sites. There's a few major publications that are also serving as fact-checking, but I think those are fine.
I would just add actually Stop Fake, which is based in Ukraine,
Stop
because the
Fake.
Ukrainians, given that they're at war with Russia, Ukrainians have been under particular attack from Russian disinformation. Sorry, go ahead.
No, that's great. And then the other piece is, check the social media profile or the website before sharing. Is this a credible source? So the next slide. What other type of content is this account posting? That's really important, because sometimes you'll look at it and it will look completely real. But then if you scroll down like 25, 50 posts, you might start seeing that this is a very strange thing, like I just talked about. So what type of content, if they're just resharing, especially on Twitter, posts from other people and they're not posting their own content, that's also a giveaway that this may not be a real account. Check the bio and the About Us. Sometimes in the problem on social media, and I think that Brian was talking about this before, is what can the companies do about it? What can Twitter do about it? What can Facebook? Because these accounts have become smarter and smarter and smarter, and people are they're developing bios that look real. They're creating using real people's photos. You may see yourself someday out there on Twitter. It may not be you. So you have to be really careful in making sure that it's a real account. So check how many followers the account has. If they have no one following them, that's a clear giveaway. And if they're just following like thousands and thousands of people, and then maybe they have like 10 followers, where are they posting from? What is the location? Do they have it there? Don't be afraid to report hateful or fake accounts. So what Frank was saying before is it's on us. We have to report. I probably report about 10 accounts every week on Twitter that I see. And it's a very easy process. And then Twitter actually tells you, hey, you reported this and we found that this was true and we took them off, or we took them down. So if you see things that are wrong or they're hateful, report it, and Twitter will handle it. Be aware of filter bubbles. A filter bubble is, we all think a certain way and we have our beliefs. And when we follow other people who have the same beliefs, we start to believe that everything that we think is correct, right? And so that's why it's really important to follow news organizations and people who may think slightly different than yourself, so you really have an understanding of what is going on. I often tell my students that social media is sort of like junk food. So yeah, we'd all like to watch the cat memes all the time, and maybe we'd like to read stories about fun things and maybe things that we maybe wouldn't typically read about. But the algorithm is giving us that junk food because that's what we are looking to get. And we're telling it every day, this is what we want to actually eat, right? So you may want fries and hamburgers and candy every day, but we know we can't actually eat that, and we need to have salads. And so if you want to have the salad, you have to go and look for it. You can't just expect that it's going to show up on your news feed. And so the algorithm is really important. And you can fix your algorithms on Google if you're doing Google News, and you can actually help so that you can see other information. And then of course, think before you post. We know with social media that anger travels faster than any other emotion. It's the most shared emotion is anger. And so if you are angry and you just share something and you don't really look to see where it's coming from, that's a problem. So if you're feeling really emotional, I recommend that you don't post. Think before you post, maybe share it the following day. I think that that's really important.
Great, good, excellent advice, Nancy. Thank you. Brian, I'm going to give you the last word. I thought the comment about fries and candy and everything, perfect segue. Over to you.
That would bring me up. Well, thank you. As a matter of fact, I think it does. No, I think Nancy hit on some really fascinating ones. I would also just sort of, as a general principle, slow down. I mean, we're consuming so much information today that the ability to truly parse through it in a diligent way is just impossible. And so we got to slow down because we're also propagating a lot of the information that's moving around. And to the point earlier from one of our participants, it is not necessarily to disinform intentionally, but we are misinforming and contributing to sort of the amount of fake information moving around. For those that are really looking to dig in on a particular topic, I mean, ask experts, right? So that's another thing you can do to just sort of validate, some of the things you're reading. Go to primary sources as opposed to looking at sources that have, filtered, perspectives out, and, sort of check your own cognitive bias that has a tendency, to create sort of these in addition to the filters, your own sort of semi-closed ecosystems that you surround yourself with people that think like you, and therefore, you subscribe to information that may reinforce a perspective that you have. And so there's a lot of onus on us, to sort of manage in the information space. And at the same time, I think we should probably approach information with a little bit more suspicion than we have in the past. I don't think we embrace enough sort of paranoia in terms of information. I know I can see a few of the participants on there that I know stay away from social media altogether because they're suspicious about what social media. David, you're one of them, but certainly I think we have to really think more critically, as Nancy said. But the issue itself is old, as Frank alluded to in his presentation, and it is not going anywhere anytime soon. Our ability to mitigate, is probably not going to be successful because the propagation and the technologies and the means in which people want to get false information out there will continue to adjust to the realities of the technologies out there to mitigate them. And so it does really put it on us to parse through this information in a diligent way. And so with that, thanks, David, for giving me the last word. And it was an honor to share the Zoom with Nancy and Frank.
Great. Yes.
The only thing I ask is that I can take a selfie right now of you guys. So here we go.
Okay, don't put it on social media though.
All right,
No, I'm joking. Because I won't be able to see it.
Officially on social media, David. There you go.
So let me just wrap.
Can I help craft the caption on that? I think we can.
Definitely not. Nope, I'm afraid your connection is failing on us. I'm sorry. Yes, by the way, I'm not on social media, and the LinkedIn account that's in my name was not created by me. But in any event, Brian Fonseca, Nancy Richmond, Frank Luca, thanks so much for joining us today. A fascinating conversation. Really appreciate you taking the time to join us. And thanks to all of you who joined as well. And thanks for your great questions on this webinar, Social Media in the Age of Disinformation, brought to you by the Ruth K. and Shepard Broad Distinguished Lecture Series. I'm David Kramer from Florida International University, Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs in Miami. Thanks very much and stay safe out there. Thank you.
Thank you for having me on.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Andre and Rico.